PlatinumGames has often been considered one of the premier developers of over-the-top spectacle action combat games. Their two most well-known franchises, of course, being Bayonetta and Nier. Unfortunately, they've also become known for delivering some less than impressive titles like Ninja Turtles Mutants in Manhattan, The Legend of Korra game, and it looks like we'll be adding the recently released Babylon's Fall to this list. The game launched this past week, although I wouldn't blame you if you didn't know that. Babylon's Fall seems to have simultaneously gone completely under the radar while also drawing a lot of criticism from the few people who do know about it. This game isn't completely without redeeming qualities, but I'm comfortable saying the few pros are far outweighed by the cons. It's not even so much that this game is awful, though some may want to paint it as such. More so, it's just mediocre, bland, and leaves a lot to be desired. I originally wanted to do a full review of Babylon's Fall, but after playing a little over 10 hours, I just can't force myself to waste another moment. This game is disappointing in a lot of ways, so I've tapped out. No, I haven't finished Babylon's Fall, but yes, I have come to a conclusion. You probably shouldn't play this game. So why is that? I'm not just gonna bash on this thing. I wanna give you some concrete examples and reasonings behind things. Well, let's begin with the oil painting in the room, which is the graphics. They are not great. In fact, I think this game looks really bad. Now, this was clearly a conscious design choice. They wanted to make the game look like an oil painting. This is further supported by their use of actual paintings to tell a lot of the story. They do have some more traditional cutscenes, but about half the time, it's zooming in on these paintings mounted to a wall and then phasing from one still frame to the next as dialogue rolls out. However, the result of this aesthetic design choice is just that the game looks very dated. The most common sentiment that I've seen going around in terms of the visuals is that it reminds people of a PS2 era game, with everything appearing super low resolution and flat. When I first started playing, I was certain that the game was just taking a while to load in. You know what I'm talking about? Like when you're playing an MMO and you first zone into a new area, and it takes a few seconds for the game to load, so you've got these characters and objects in the environment with no detail whatsoever. But no, it's not that the game was taking a while to load the textures in, it's just that there aren't any textures in the game. I'm being hyperbolic, but I don't know a better way to say it. Visually, this game is not pleasant to look at. Everything appears low resolution, muddy, flat, and it's all made worse by this decision to throw a camera filter on top of the whole thing. While you're playing the game and during cutscenes, there is this constant smudge filter that looks as if someone smeared grease all over the camera lens. It is very noticeable. Now, like I said, none of this was a mistake. This didn't happen by accident. They clearly had a visual aesthetic they were going for, and they built the game to look this way with that in mind. I just don't think it looks good, and I'm not alone here. I do find some of the character models, the armor design, and the enemies and stuff pretty neat. There are things about the appearance that I like, but overall, it's unappealing. Graphics take a backseat to combat and overall game design. So how are those? In terms of its structure, Babylon's Fall is a linear, mission-based, online-only games-as-a-service title. After a short tutorial, you're introduced to the headquarters. This is a small social hub with quest and vendor NPCs, and also other players roaming around. I think at most I've seen around 3 to 5 people at a time. It looks like they kind of just phase players into your play space, similar to what's done in games like Destiny. So you can walk around and you'll see other players, you can check out their gear, interact with them with emotes, but you've also got vendors you can buy, sell, or craft items at. There's this appearance vendor, a storage chest, and a handful of other NPCs in the play space that you can talk with, and you'll get a few lines of dialogue relevant to your current story progression. Now, in terms of actually playing the game, there are these mission NPCs standing by quest boards. You'll go talk with them, and you've got a couple options. You can quick match, joining other players, or you can just start your own mission. So you've got a linear path of progression to work through. This is called the Tower of Babylon. This begins with mission number 1 in the Civic Cloister, which kind of acts more or less like a region with its own visual appearance and tile set. So you select your first mission, you click start, and then the game automatically opens up a party interface while attempting to match you with 3 other players. This is actually quite similar to how things work in Monster Hunter World, for example. Other people can join in, helping you on your mission, or you can just ready up and go it alone. Once everyone in your party is ready, a short timer counts down, and then you load into the mission. Now, the structure of the levels in this game is fairly simple. You've got combat arenas where you fight and a series of corridors connecting them. So you first load in, you get this little intro camera pan of you and your party, and then you move down a linear corridor until you reach your first combat arena. There, you'll fight back waves of enemies that spawn in, and once cleared, you get a rating, and then the path opens up, letting you go down the next corridor towards your next combat arena. Every mission will have a handful of these going back and forth from corridor to arena, and will end in either some large group encounter or in an actual boss fight. It's a fairly straightforward structure, and while fundamentally identical, the different missions and zones, which again are called cloisters, do offer variety in the hallway arena layout. You'll have sections with environmental hazards. There will be pits you'll have to jump over, ice spikes that can damage you, or maybe there'll be some wind that can knock you off your track. There's also a few levels where there was this dragon making strafing runs, breathing fire on the path that I thought was really cool. Sometimes you'll need to grapple over chasms or lava pools. There will be underwater sections where you go in areas of water and fight enemies while submerged. But yeah, generally speaking, you load in, you walk a straight path, fight in a small area, walk, fight, rinse, and repeat. Now, at the end of each mission, you are given a rating or score based on your performance. Performing well enough will give you some bonus currency. And then during the mission, you also collect various currencies, resources, and items, which you can identify at the end of the mission. Then you load out, headed back to the headquarters, where at that point, you can sell your gear, equip any gear that's upgrades for you, which will increase your item level, making you stronger before moving on to the next mission. Every single mission in the game, as you progress down this linear path, will have like a recommended power level, basically. In the 10 hours I've spent with the game so far, that is the entire gameplay loop. You do a mission, you collect and equip gear, and then you move on to the next mission. Now, so far, I've unlocked 4 of the cloisters or zones, each with more levels than the last, and also set in, again, new visually distinct areas. And they do get more interesting and complex. Basically, it is still linear path arena. I'm just going to assume this continues for however long the game lasts. I know at some point that this linear progression ends and you open up a system of more varied, repeatable combat. It will have the same structure, but it's not down this straight narrative path that you take in everything that I've seen so far. Although, as I've mentioned, I have no interest and don't expect I will continue to play long enough to reach that point. And there's a few major reasons why, so let's move into that. Okay, so if I have anything positive to say, it is that the one redeeming quality of Babylon's Fall is the combat. But even this is far from great. It's not the worst action game that I've ever played. I would consider it passable and even fun in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it just pales in comparison to prior Platinum titles. So much so that I almost find it hard to believe they were developed by the same people. And I say this with all due respect. There's almost no way they had their A-team working on this game. My expectation coming into playing Babylon's Fall was that I would be getting a smooth, fast-paced, over-the-top action, akin to what Platinum has shown themselves capable of with Nier and Bayonetta. This is not that. A majority of your playtime, you'll be fighting against basic enemies in those combat arenas we discussed. And this, unfortunately, is just painfully boring most of the time, mainly because the AI are nothing more than punching bags, providing little challenge and requiring little strategy. Here's an example 2 hours into my playthrough that really showcases how uninteresting a lot of encounters are. I am literally walking in circles, and these guys couldn't hit me if their life depended on it. Now, you may say this is unfair. Even games with fantastic combat will have stupid fodder enemies, and that's true. I think my issue, though, is that they drag out the time you spend fighting brain-dead enemies for far too long. Fights like this are a regular occurrence and didn't really start to get interesting until around like the 9-hour mark, but that's gonna be far too late for many people. And I also think it's a shame because I don't feel that the overall combat is as bad as a lot of people have been saying. So they've got this 4-weapon system that is really actually fairly interesting. You have a slot for a light attack, heavy attack, and then 2 spectral weapon slots. And you can use whichever weapons you like in each of those spots. So you could use a sword for your light attack, a hammer for heavy, and then 2 bows as your spectral weapons. Or maybe I will use a bow light attack, a sword heavy, and then a spectral hammer and a spectral wand. Literally any combination of the weapons that you find in this game can be slotted into any spot, which is really neat. And then you've got all of the this wide variety of attack chain combos. It's got all of the usual fare, like you can spam light attacks and they'll have like a 3 to 5 combo thing that all ends in a big flourish, or you can go light light heavy, or light heavy light, or there are sprinting attacks, jumping attacks, dodging attacks, charging attacks, and each of those have their own unique patterns and effects. They've actually got a fair amount of variety here. And then on top of that, there are the spectral weapons that you can use whenever, regardless of whatever else you're doing. So you can be in the middle of charging a heavy attack while at the same time spamming spectral bow attacks and then charging up a spectral rod attack. It's actually a really cool concept. And I'll admit, in fact, that it took some time to get used to, trying to coordinate whatever attacks that I was doing with my physical light and heavy weapons with my movement and trying to dodge enemy damage, and then independently also figuring out what I wanted to do with each of my spectral weapons. It did feel a little clumsy at first, but over time I found myself actually enjoying trying to juggle all of those elements of combat. In fact, maybe that explains why so many of the enemies those first few hours are incredibly dull. Maybe they figured it was needed while people were getting familiar with this 4-weapon combat system on top of their character movement and positioning to avoid damage. If anything though, I feel like they should have changed that. I feel like they should have made fights with the enemies engaging immediately, but then just made systems more complex. So maybe slowly introduce the 4-weapon system. Have us fight smart enemies that require paying attention and dodging, and don't just stand there like idiots, but just have us use the physical light and heavy weapon slots at first, and then after 30 to 45 minutes, introduce the first spectral weapon, and then a little while later, introduce the second spectral weapon. In fact, from what I understand, there's even more elements to this combat system that I haven't even unlocked yet 10 hours into the game. But instead, what they're doing is they give us this 4-weapon slots immediately and then make the first 5 or 7 hours of playtime against just brain dead, super stupid, easy AI that like will barely attack even if you're pretty much standing still. Now, punctuating that period of time though is the boss fights, which I think are really the shining star of this game. From the boss's appearance to the actual encounter designs, even the first couple of fights I found really engaging. They all have a large variety of move sets with various phases that they go through and mechanics that require careful positioning and dodging of big attacks. There's also this DPS phase mechanic in the fights that I've seen. So for example, the first boss would periodically summon a sword barrier. This would create a wall of swords that you'd have to damage yourself through and then quickly try to damage down a structure in the center before this ever-expanding ring reaches the edges of the room, and if you don't do this in time, your entire party will take massive damage. There was also this rock boss that would gain an overshield that if you didn't work through in time, he would explode, knocking you back and dealing damage. One boss fight was against a tower, like a physical tower that would shoot lightning balls in various patterns, and there were smaller supporting towers along the edge, as well as spiders that kept spawning in. But the absolute coolest fight that I went through was against Moira, this large spider with like 2 heads and 2 massive cleavers, and she had some really cool attacks. She would lock you in place, she would have all these like elemental attacks, and at one point she even transitioned where her abdomen changed into this massive 3rd head that would shoot out this like beam of lightning. It was really crazy, really over the top, and really fun. In general, I have really enjoyed boss fights in this game. That's also why it's such a shame that the rest of playing this game has felt so bland 10 hours in. In fact, had you told me that this was the first game from some up-and-coming scrappy AA developer, I would be impressed. It's like not a bad first shot, but because this is from Platinum, expectations are so much higher than what they've delivered. I expect way more than mediocre, but that's what we got. It's just not up to par and really impossible to recommend, especially when you also consider this game's pricing. Everything about Babylon's Fall screams that it is a free-to-play games as a service title, except it's not free-to-play. They're charging $60. This almost certainly is a large part of the reason why so few people are playing the game, which we'll get onto in a moment, and is also likely one of the reasons it will ultimately fail. All signs point to that being the case. Like, unless they transition into making this game free, which does seem like a decent possibility, unless they just shut it down entirely, which also seems possible at this point. But yeah, as of now, Babylon's Fall will run you $59.99 or $99.99 if you want the digital deluxe edition, which comes with a few cosmetic items, but also this amulet, this this accessory, which as of now, 10 hours in, has remained the best in slot item that I've come across. Like in terms of the enchantments, which are basically buffs that it gives you, I have yet to find a better item to replace it so far. I'm sure that will change at some point, but for the entirety of my playtime with the game, it has been the best item I've seen. Now, this isn't game breaking or pay to win, not really, but it's not a great look either. On top of that, there is also an in-game cash shop letting you exchange real money for this currency called Geras. As of now, this can only be exchanged for some cosmetic items, stances, emotes, and such. Obviously, it is entirely possible sometime later down the road they will change this and they will sell more vital things, but for now it is all just vanity stuff, so that's fine. But then we've got the battle pass as well, which includes cosmetic and vanity items, currencies and resources, and then also boosters giving you temporary buffs to things like experience gain, item drops, and rare spawns. There's both a free and premium track and the ability to spend Geras currency to unlock the tiers, so rather than grinding you can just spend real money, which is pretty common in a lot of live service games. Which reminds me, yes, as I said, this is a games as a service title and comes with all of the usual trappings that you might expect. There are daily login bonuses, the battle pass that we mentioned, and then there are also daily, weekly, and seasonal quests. So each of these things give you cosmetics along with materials and currencies that you'll need to exchange in the game's crafting and other things. But the idea behind these systems is pretty simple. It's meant to give players items that they need for progression or access to cool looking cosmetics as a reward for booting up the game every single day, which in turn will likely result in them playing for a bit, driving up the game's engagement. If you play any modern day popular games as a service, you are no doubt familiar with each of these systems, although it's much harder of a pill to swallow in a title that also has a full $60 box price, and even more difficult when you consider the fact that, yeah, this is just an overall mediocre game. I think my favorite quote that I've heard discussing this aspect of Babylon's Fall was that it's awfully presumptuous of them to have all of these FOMO-inducing systems and to be monetizing the game on so many different levels at such a high price, assuming that anyone likes the game enough to stick around and engage with any of these things. But maybe one of the most revealing things about Babylon's Fall is the fact that much of the game's armor consists of reused assets from Final Fantasy XIV. Yes, you heard me correctly. In fact, in a blog post last year, the game's director confirmed that Babylon's Fall was in fact reusing armor, saying that during a presentation of their game, the Final Fantasy XIV team offered to help them add more variety to the gear in their game. And I appreciate they might want to make development a little easier, but it also has me wondering how much else of the game is an asset flip. Have they also reused environmental assets, attack animations, enemy design, enemy attack patterns, and just not told us yet because no one noticed? I mean, yes, this is an entirely unsubstantiated claim, but man, if they are willing to just straight rip with permission or not, assets for their armor in their game, it doesn't paint the best picture for how passionate they are about the title. Like, yeah, let's just use whatever armor. It doesn't matter where it comes from. We don't have our own unique vision for how gear should look. I mean, they do have unique gear, but it is crazy to me that they're just like willing to wholesale copy-paste armor from Final Fantasy XIV, and that they don't appear to care enough about making their game distinct to not just use another game's work. And I think that's the real issue I have with this. Like, yes, game development is hard, it takes a long time. If you have like hundreds of armors and you use some of those armors from another game, I get the justification for that. But it also just makes you feel like they really don't care about this game that much. They don't have their own unique vision, and they're just wanting to get this together as quickly as possible, shove it out the door, and, well, turns out that may have been the wrong decision. Because if their intent was, in fact, to throw this game together, flip some assets, and make a quick buck, it appears to not have worked out so well. Launch week numbers, as you may have heard, for Babylon's Fall have been abysmal. SteamDB shows the game's peaking at around 1,200 concurrent players. Not exactly impressive for the newest PlatinumGames title. I don't want to pretend that concurrent Steam count tells the entire story though. After all, the game is also available on PlayStation consoles, and they certainly have their own player count there as well to take into consideration. But just for perspective, let's compare the launch week numbers of Babylon's Fall to their last game that made it to Steam, which was Nier Automata. That launched in 2017, and during its launch week reached a peak of 23,000 concurrent players. In fact, Nier's most recent 24-hour peak peak is higher than that of Babylon's Fall, and Nier released 5 years ago. All of this is to say it's pretty clear that at least on the PC, not a lot of people are playing this game, which raises its own set of problems. Given this is a multiplayer nature, it's not just that you can play in groups of 4, but that the game is designed specifically for that. Now, from my own experience and from everything I've read, there is no scaling of difficulty based on your party size. It looks like Babylon's Fall is tailored for full groups of 4 players, so having less simply puts you at a disadvantage. Now, if you're someone who wants to play solo, this ends up meaning that runs will take significantly longer and be significantly more challenging, but not because encounters are more interesting, just that enemy health is scaled up, so only one person doing damage really drags out the length of the encounters. I found avoiding damage to be pretty easy because, like I mentioned, the AI is fairly simplistic, with maybe the one exception being those boss fights. But because mob health is designed for a full group, it takes quite a long time to work through their health bars by yourself, and it's not exactly the most engaging combat because of how unresponsive that AI is. So why don't you just not play solo, you might say? Well, that doesn't really seem to be up to you either, because due to this game's low player count, even finding other players to fill a group has been a challenge. Over the past few days, I've only gone on a single mission that had an entire group of 4 players. About half the time, I would get like 1 or 2 people in my group. The other half of the time, it would just be me. I would go to the quest board and start a mission, and not a single person would join into my party, and then after like 60 or so seconds, the game just automatically starts the mission for you, whether or not you've readied up. So unless they patch the game and make some changes and add difficulty scaling, this is going to be a major issue for the dwindling player base and already really small player base that the game has. And in terms of just the overall reception, as you may have figured out, well, it's not been so great. Currently, the game is sitting at a mixed rating on Steam. It has under 200 reviews, which is a very small number, obviously attributed to the fact that not a lot of people are playing the game. And also Metacritic scores are very poor, and on OpenCritic, it is showing that only 13% are recommending the game. Now, in a lot of the online discussions about Babylon's Fall, I've been seeing people point to poor release timing and poor marketing as the main reasons. And yes, it's not great that this game launched shortly after Elden Ring, and it doesn't seem like Square Enix has done enough or good enough of a job marketing the game. But those are not the real reasons for Babylon's Fall failure. You know, I wouldn't even call this a terrible game. Like I said, I just think it's very mediocre with average combat, and I would classify the overall experience as fairly boring because of how they've laid things out. Couple it with being a full price game and having an in-game cash shop and a season pass, there's just not a compelling argument for recommending this to anybody. There are so many better live service titles that you could play, better looking, better playing, and more affordable. You know, games as a service titles by their very nature do tend to draw the experience out. Perfect example, while browsing various threads discussing Babylon's Fall in response to the criticism of the game not being especially engaging or especially fun, I saw a lot of responses where people said, hey, it gets much better at 20 or 30 or 40 hours in. And I think for many people, myself included, there's just become increasingly less patience for muscling through a mediocre experience with the promise that it'll get slightly less mediocre after you sink 1 full work week's worth of time into it. As a longtime fan and avid player of MMOs, I'm all too familiar with this sentiment, but at least MMOs offer like large-scale immersive worlds to engage in. Large-scale and immersive Babylon's Fall is not. An unfortunate art direction, passable combat, and borrowed assets it is. This is such a far cry from Nier Automata, and my only hope is that the failure of Babylon's Fall will be a wake-up call for whoever is steering the ship at the studio. Unfortunately, despite how much I respect Platinum and admire some of the games they've made in the past, I do not suggest playing Babylon's Fall. And that is going to do it for today's video. As always, thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.